Section 32 of G.K. Chesterton's newspaper columns, The New Witness, 1921. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton's newspaper columns, The New Witness, 1921, by G.K. Chesterton. At the Sign of the World's End, The Spade and the Spinning Wheel. Hundreds of people have read the story about the medieval demagogue who went about repeating the rhyme, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Many have doubtless offered the obvious answer to the question, the serpent, for he had no such vulgar task, but followed the profession of diplomacy, not to say secret diplomacy. And he offered to human beings the opportunity to become as gods by the possession of superior information, which may be regarded as an aristocratic ideal. But few seem to have noticed a much more obvious fact about this very familiar story. Whatever answers were given to the demagogue then, there can be no doubt about the answer that could be given to him now. If that innocent agitator went about propounding his simple riddle in the modern world, the modern reply would naturally be, Adam never delved and Eve never span, for the simple reason that they never existed. They are fragments of a Chaldeo-Babylonian mythos, and Adam is only a slight variation of Tagtug, pronounced Utu. For the real beginning of humanity, we refer you to Darwin's Origin of Species. And then the modern man would go on to justify plutocracy to the medieval man by talking about the struggle for life and the survival of the fittest, and how the strongest man seized authority by means of anarchy, and proved himself a gentleman by behaving like a cad. Now, I do not base my beliefs on the theology of John Ball, or on the literal and materialistic reading of the text of Genesis. But it does seem to me a cogent and crucial fact that the idealism of the leveler could be put in the form of an appeal to Scripture, and cannot be put in the form of an appeal to science. It is true that I come across a great deal of crude skepticism, which seems really to be a sudden emancipation from an equally crude credulity. I, for one, never took the letter of the Hebrew Scriptures, or of any religious records, quite so much for granted as the skeptics seem to have done. The newspapers are always taking note of some learned latitudinarian who says he can no longer believe, something that I am surprised to hear of his ever believing. When the Dean of Dunstable startles the journalist by saying, "We can no longer accept the doctrine that heaven is on the other side of the moon," or when Canon Cadgerboy, that fine scholar, observes, "I cannot pretend that the idea of the devil living up the chimney stands where it did," I do indeed share something of the journalist's wonder, but it is rather at what such distinguished scholars did believe than at what they don't. But about the proper interpretation of Genesis I am quite agnostic, and have that readiness to accept authority which is the real logic of agnosticism. I am dealing here only with the moral and social effects of the notion, and the negation of the notion. And I think it obvious that in the medieval argument equality does really stand or fall with Eden, or with something analogous to Eden. If there was never a platform of equality on which humanity began as purely human, if at every stage there was only the inequality of relative and varying evolution, the particular argument of the medieval democrat certainly fails. Yet every one is driven back on using it, in one form or another, whenever it is necessary to assert the equality or even the fraternity of men. Tennyson was, if ever there was one, an evolutionist in his vision and an aristocrat in his sympathies. His political ideas were so little revolutionary that he could never mention the French Revolution without some shrill and febrile sneer at the French for not having stopped at the exact stage of constitutional compromise at which John Bull had just planted himself. Yet even the evolutionary prophet of John Bull has to use the doctrinal argument of John Ball. When he happens to be annoyed with a society lady, he reminds her that the grand old gardener of his wife smile at the claims of long descent, their own descent being a trifle short. He has evidently forgotten all about Darwin and the long descent of man. If the religious argument for democracy is used by an evolutionist like Tennyson, it is used far more resolutely by the real revolutionists like Robespierre and Jefferson. Robespierre was so certain that there could be no republic without God that he wanted to execute atheists as traitors. And the Declaration of Independence, on which the great republic of the West is founded, dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created men equal. And it is right, for if they were not created equal, they were certainly evolved unequal. But there is another application of the old rhyme which is not inappropriate to the New World, and especially to what is called the New Woman. I am here using the Eden story merely as a convenient parable, and indeed it is obvious that John Ball himself was referring to a period subsequent to Eden. Adam may have delved in the garden, but it seems rather superfluous for Eve to spin, in the light of the fashions then in vogue. But if we take for the sake of symbolic simplicity the image of the man and woman first starting to support themselves on this earth, certain primary ideas are plain enough. Adam will certainly regard the land he delves as his own land, if only because there is nobody to dispute it with him. But by the time that Eve has really begun to spin, she will certainly regard spinning as an even more personal and private act than delving. There is about the material apparatus and circumstances of the old spinning something a little less public, communal, and plainly dependent on conditions outside than is the case with agriculture. And there is about the ultimate business of clothing humanity something more personal than the immediate business of feeding him. Being more domestic, it is also more despotic, more at the mercy of that artistic authority which looks like caprice. Corn cannot be grown green or red at the last moment, as clothes can be dyed green or red at the last moment. You cannot trim a hedge as you trim a hat, by hanging new and fantastic things onto it. Nor can the outline of the coming cabbage fluctuate and expand in the mind like that of the coming coat and trousers. From the very first there is about the traditional occupation of Eve something a little more distinguished and individual, and the modern world retains this touch of liberty so far as it retains any liberty at all. We know the process by which the primitive liberty has been lost, if it were ever found. Multitudes have never dug in their own land, but in our own phase of history a peculiar growth of greed and pride, with philosophies supporting them, have shut out the majority, first from working on their own land, and then from working on the land at all. Machinery has deprived both man and woman of their tools. Adam is henceforth forbidden to call a spade, if only because he has to call it an electro-hydraulic excavator, or something of the sort. In what was once woman's department, the spinning wheel has given place to the spinning jenny. It sounds like a pathetic pun that it should be given a sort of feminine nickname, at the very moment when it ceased to be feminine. The process has become as public and impersonal as any other type of industrial toil. As we accept as normal a nameless army of miners, so we accept a nameless army of spinners. At least it would surprise them to be called an army of spinsters. The old freedom of property and privacy has failed for both sexes. But the point to seize is that in spite of all the real domestic abuses, more of it remains for the woman than for the man. What the clerk's wife does in the suburbs may be a little like spinning. What the clerk does in the city is not in the least like delving. When the wife dyes the curtains or the clothes, she does do it to some extent, at least in accordance with her own taste in colors. It would be unwise for the clerk to arrange the postage stamps on a parcel in a decorative scheme in accordance with his own taste in colors. Above all, the woman does feel that she is dealing freely and confidently with private property, whereas her husband is naturally nervous in dealing with the firm's property. And the sensations of a man working in a big bank are almost exactly the same as those of a man working in a big post office. In both, the machinery is not only not his own private property, but it does not feel like private property at all. the great shop can be quite as impervious to its customers as the government department, and the government department can be quite as callous to its servants as the great shop. This modern oppression, the very machinery of monotony, has really driven all the freedom worth having, the creative freedom of the craftsman or the cultivator, into smaller and smaller areas. One of the few social figures that still has some remnants of it, though holding them at 100 disadvantages, is the old-fashioned housewife. She alone is left, and they seek her life to take it away. In the discussions about the New Woman, we are incessantly informed that in the society of the past the feminine partner was despised. The more enthusiastic feminists seem to prefer to add that the feminine partner was not only despised but despicable. An excellent corrective to all this nonsense can be found in the popular mythology and imagery of the past, and an excellent example of it can be found in the very case of the image employed in the rhyme of John Ball. It was never suggested that the Lord of Olympus should be represented holding a spade instead of a scepter, or even that the warrior king of old should be equipped with spades instead of spears. But high above all heavenly and human thrones, the ancient world saw its vision of the mysterious mothers, in whose hands at least lie all the destiny and death of men, and saw in a woman's spinning wheel the symbol of the wheel of the world. End of section 32.